Welcome, Professor Petraglia. Welcome, everyone. It's past noon in Jeddah. It's now 38 degrees outside, so it's a good time for cultural heritage lecture. For those who are not here at the last seminars, I want to introduce myself. I am Dr. Laurent Sapio. I live and work in Saudi Arabia since 10 years. I'm an archaeologist working at King Abdullah University of Science and Technology. I'm conducting some archaeological research and cultural outreach. In this framework, I've been organizing there a cultural heritage event series since a few years. Because now of the COVID situation, it's becoming a webinar series accessible from everywhere in the world. And this is today the third webinar. The Cultural Heritage Event Series aims to increase awareness about the unique cultural and archaeological heritage in Saudi Arabia, covering a wide range of topics, but sometimes we also make some digressions and have special edition. Before introducing further our speaker and the lecture, I would like to make two remarks. First, the presentation will be followed by a regular Q&A session, absolutely like in live talks. You can ask questions anytime using the Q&A tab. Please, if you can avoid asking questions on the chat tab and use preferably the Q&A, it's better. The questions will be answered at the end of this presentation by Professor Petraglia. Second remark, I will launch a poll, a short one with two basic questions, just for me to understand the composition of the audience. So thank you very much for that. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce, to welcome Professor Michael Petraglia. He graduated from New York University and the University of New Mexico. Professor Petraglia started his career as a lecturer at the University of Cambridge and then became Professor of Human Evolution and Prehistory at the University of Oxford. In 2016, he moved to the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History. He leads their large-scale interdisciplinary archaeological projects internationally and including, of course, Saudi Arabia. He has authored and co-edited 10 books and over 200 journal articles centering on a wide range of subjects in human evolution and prehistory. Through his presentation, Professor Petraglia will display a different face of Arabia that most of people here have never heard about. This is, of course, the result of years of investigation through your ERC-funded Paleodesert project. Thank you very much, Mike, for accepting our invitation. The floor and the audience are now yours.
Thank you so much. It's it's a great honor to be here, and it's just wonderful to be part of this webinar series. It's a modern world, obviously, to be able to be lecturing. This is only my second lecture on in this new world of lecturing, and I see that there's already 190 people watching. So that's very impressive, more than I can normally reach in my classroom. So it's great to reach out across the world, and I really appreciate this invitation from KAUST. And I suppose I will share my presentation now. I've been working in Saudi Arabia since my first visit was in 2001. So it's been a long time now, but we've been working full throttle, doing field work for at least the past 10 years in Saudi Arabia. And today I'm going to present a lot of that overview of that field work. But it's been a great honor to work with the Saudis and the Saudi government. I've worked under the umbrella of the Heritage Commission and the ministries, the Ministry of Tourism and the Ministry of Culture. And it's been a wonderful opportunity to work with these organizations and developing partnerships and friendships along the way. You know, working in Arabia has been most fascinating for me. It's a stunning landscape. It's a stunning geography. And I think you'll see that it has an amazing archaeological record, which can, of course, tell us a lot about the past. But as I will also argue today, I think it could tell us a lot about the contemporary world. So today I will center on three topics, as you see here on the screen. I will talk a lot about climate change, human migrations, as well as what is the effect of climate change on human populations in Arabia. There are three themes that I will go over today, as you see here. The earliest humans, I'll talk about the earliest archaeological record, and then I'll talk about the origins of us in Arabia, our species, Homo sapiens, and what evidence we have for that. And then the third part of this lecture, I'll be talking about climate change and what effect did it have on human populations. But before I do that, I want to say, yes, we are the Paleodeserts projects as introduced here. This project has been going full steam ahead for about the past 10 years. We are also known from a public perspective as the Green Arabia Project, which some of you may have heard about. But you can visit our website, which has all sorts of information on our project. We try to keep it current. I have to update it even now. But we're quite proud of the accomplishments that we've had here. This project started with very large-scale funding from the European Research Council, which went on for about 5 years. And then now I'm at the Max Planck, where this project is carrying on now and well into the future. We're very proud of the accomplishments that we've had. We have something like on the order of 85 journal, journal articles. And so we've been very successful in publishing the results of our work. But we've also reached the public in general. We've had a lot of media exposure from the international press as well as the national press. So we're quite happy that we've made a lot of scientific contributions, but we're also thinking that it's very important, of course, to reach the public. And so we try to do our best with advertising our work and trying to educate the public to what we're trying to do. You know, the core of this project is really the team. We have a very large-scale international team. Much of what I'll be talking about over the next hour rests on a lot of the individuals on this team. We have more than 100 individuals hailing from at least 20 countries that have come to Saudi Arabia. So this is a very large-scale international effort, and everything I'm going to be presenting today is an overview of that work. And this is not all about me. It's about all the people that have been working on this project. So I really appreciate, I can't name everyone, but it's been absolutely brilliant to work side by side with the Saudis, of course, but also my colleagues from many other countries. And we have a very large group, like I said, of all walks of life, from professors to students, and every people of all walks of life. And we have males and females working side by side in the field. This is a very, very interdisciplinary project. As you can see here, the project puts together a number of fields of inquiry in order to tell a story about humans and human evolution in Arabia. So we have people coming from different disciplines, all coming together in order to tell a common story about the past. So you can see here just some workshops and conferences and publications which center on archaeology, biological anthropology, genetics, and the earth sciences. So we all come together in order to try to tell a story about the past. And you can just see here in terms of our approach to the project, we have all sorts of different methods that are coming to play here, from climate modeling to remote sensing to rock art studies to geochronology to stable isotope methods to archaeobotany. So these are just some of the methods that we employ in order to study and examine the archaeological sites that we're working on in Arabia. With respect to approach to this project, one of the most fascinating things for me is mapping that is being done by our colleagues in London. And this has been a very intensive effort. And we have been mapping literally all the river networks of Arabia. And this is most fascinating because, you know, we stereotypically think of Arabia as just a very dry and arid landscape. But as you can see here, there were many rivers across Arabia in the past. And not only there were many rivers that flowed across Arabia, but we've also looked at the lakes that were present in Arabia, as you can see here on the right. And we have specialists that are looking at this paleohydrology. And what's most fascinating to me are not only the whole networks of rivers that existed in the past across Arabia, but also the lakes. These ancient lakes and wetlands are most fascinating, and you'll see that they were a real magnet to animals and people in the past. And believe it or not, we have now counted 10,000 ancient lakes of Arabia, 10,000 lakes that once existed in Arabia. And as you'll see, these lakes didn't all exist at once. They existed over the last 1 million years. So we are interested in the last 1 million years of occupation history from 1 million years ago all the way up to the present. And we are looking at these landscapes and what does the archaeological record look relative to them. So we do this mapping from a methodological standpoint, but of course this is all desktop work, but we of course have to get out into the field to verify the accuracy of this river and lake network. And we have visited some of these spots, and we have visited about 200 lakes so far. We have normally employed jeeps to get out there in some very tough circumstances to get out there. But sometimes, thanks to the Saudi Geological Survey, we can also get out there with helicopter. And so what we're trying to do here is verify from the desktop work that these rivers and lakes once existed. And lo and behold, when we get out there, we touch down on these places and we are in fact able to verify, for example, that we do have lake deposits. As you can see here from the air, here's an ancient lake, one of those 10,000 lakes of Arabia. We touch down on that terrain and you can see here, this is a lake deposit. These are clays and muds that existed once in the past, of course, indicating a very wet and humid condition. And most remarkably, of the several hundred lakes that we've actually visited, we have fossils and archaeology on about 70% of them. So the archaeology is amazing. It's along these lake shores, and we have some very well preserved sites over hundreds of thousands of years. And so I'll present some of that work today and what we're learning about it. So that's sort of some of our methods and our approach to this work. And so now I can turn to some of the topics that I'd like to cover today. And the first topic I'd like to cover is what we have learned about the earliest human occupation of Arabia. And just by way of background, I thought I'd illustrate here a human family tree. This is a very simplified rendition of that human family tree. And as you can see on the side which points to Africa, we have species in Africa, the origins of which lay in Africa, like species like Homo erectus and Homo heidelbergensis, and our own species, Homo sapiens, all in Africa. And so this, of course, has been discovered through fossils and archaeological work in Africa. And Arabia hasn't been such a large part of this evolutionary story for a very long period of time. So we're learning a lot in the last decade or so. And what you can see depicted here is our movements of these species out of Africa and into Europe and the rest of Asia. And so we have the origins of these early humans and our species itself in Africa, and then we have movements of these species out of Africa. Now, when you're thinking about the movement of early humans and even our own species out of Africa, you have to think about Arabia. Arabia is a critical geographic landmass to consider how hominins, how early humans moved out of Africa and how they got to the rest of the world. And like I said, we don't really know a lot about Arabia. We're trying our best to our work, plus of course, the work of other colleagues working across Arabia. And we're uncovering a lot of information, but there's a lot that we still don't know. We have archaeological sites in Arabia, perhaps dating back to 800,000 years ago now. And so this is the time period of perhaps Homo erectus or a Homo heidelbergensis, but we do not have their fossils. We just have archaeological sites, but by way of correspondence to Africa, we think that these early species, of course, migrated into Arabia. And so here you have one of our oldest archaeological sites in Arabia that we've now been dating and trying to date. It's most difficult to date some of these archaeological sites. But so here you can see a classic lake bed situation. So this is in the heart of the Nafud Desert. And we've dated these different lake deposits anywhere between 800,000 years ago up to around 300,000 years ago. And you can see here our very careful and methodological excavation, in which you'll see in a moment what we're uncovering there. And this site, Tisalgata, is the most fascinating site. It's a jewel of Arabia, if you will. It's very unique. This site, you can see we've spent a long time on excavating it very properly. And this site runs for 1 kilometer in length. So there are buried deposits for at least 1 kilometer. And we've scanned the dunes as well. And we can see that these lake deposits go under the dunes as well. So we know this is a very rich archaeological site and one of the oldest for Arabia. And what have we found there? Well, we found that our best archaeological evidence occurs anywhere between 500,000 to 300,000 years ago in the upper lake deposits. And you can see here one of our excavations. And we find fossils. We find fossils of all types of mammals. And most commonly types of mammals, which we think of the Arabian oryx. But what's so amazing about this site is not only the abundance of fossils, all of which look like museum specimens, but we're actually uncovering some bones with cut marks on them. So these cut marks, if you can see these long linear grooves on the bone, are from stone tools that we find on the site that have been used by early humans to access meat. So they're butchering animals, they're butchering carcasses in order to access meat. And perhaps they're hunting or scavenging these carcasses, but there's a lot more that we need to learn from this site. So this site is rather unique, and we've been working and publishing on it for a long time, but there's so much more that needs to be studied and learned from a site like this. And so this is the first hints that we have of early humans exiting Africa and moving across Arabia, and then probably onward into other parts of Eurasia. With respect to the earliest humans of Arabia, we also have another set of very fascinating sites outside of the Nafud Desert, here depicted at Dawadmi in central Saudi Arabia. And this is, again, most fascinating to me because you see that if you look at this map in the upper left-hand corner, you can see the river systems in Africa, but also all across Arabia. So this site here occurs right in central Arabia, right in the heart. And we can see that early humans would have used these rivers and lake systems to navigate, to get all across Arabia. And not only were they following the fresh water resources and the animals, which would have also been migrating across this area, but they also were stone tool users. And so they needed to access and procure stone tools for their maintaining their lifestyles and for butchering animals. And so what we found here at Dawadmi was something amazing. We found that these dikes depicted here, these are called dikes, volcanic dikes. And these volcanic dikes can be used in order to manufacture stone tools. And you can see these stone tools have very particular shapes to them. They're bifacial and they're very sharp when they're manufactured, so they can be used for things like butchery. So these early humans were going to these dikes and they were making the stone tools there. But what we did was we did surveys all across this volcanic landscape, and you can see dikes in the background here. And these dikes exist for literally hundreds of kilometers. And we have done surveys of these dikes, and you can see the red in red here on the lower left-hand corner are these maps of these dikes. And we've surveyed these dikes. And what you have depicted here in green are archaeological sites. And we have found literally hundreds of kilometers of these early human sites in Saudi Arabia. It's one of the largest and longest landscapes of early humans known anywhere in the world. And so it is most fascinating because as you survey along the dikes, you find these things like these hand axes all across this landscape. And we have dated one particular site, which we call Safaka, based on early excavations there in the 1980s. We've gone back here and we've dated this site for the very first time to about 200,000 years ago. So again, this is in the zone of early humans like Homo heidelbergensis, which may have been manufacturing these very distinctive stone tool technologies. And in our excavations, we've not only successfully dated this site 200,000 years ago, but we've uncovered many stone tools. So this excavation at Safaka has recovered many thousands of stone tools in stratified, buried contexts. And what you see here are these very large flakes that early humans are going to boulders, and they're striking these very large flakes off of these boulders. So what you see here are moments in time, 200,000 years ago or so. And the early humans are going to the boulders, they're striking them with big hammer stones, and they're getting these flakes right here at this spot. And then they're manufacturing these very distinctive stone tool industries. And then, of course, they're carrying them across the landscape. Like I said, we have these distributed for several hundred kilometers. So this is a most remarkable and incredible landscape, telling us a lot about stone tool use and landscape behaviors of these early humans in Saudi Arabia. But we know little else really about these early humans. But we know a lot more about the last few 100,000 years, particularly in the time period that we've been most interested in looking at our species, Homo sapiens in Arabia. And I should just say, like I said earlier, that the origins of our species lays in Africa. There's a very good overall fossil record in Africa, which indicates the origins of our species may be as early as 300,000 years ago in Africa. But there are many fossils, as you see here on the left, that go from 250,000, 160,000, and so on and so forth. So there's a long legacy of Homo sapiens being in Africa. And before I really got into the fieldwork of Arabia, geneticists had been arguing for many years in very many high-profile articles, like in Nature and Science, that our origins, of course, lay in Africa. But the successful dispersal of Homo sapiens out of Africa was about 60,000 years ago. And there was an argument that we all, of course, have a very common genetic legacy. And they've put a time clock on that legacy and have argued that the movement out of Africa was very rapid because of our common genetic legacy across the rest of Eurasia. And there was an argument that this because of how similar our gene pool was, that this had to have been a very rapid migration out of Africa. And there was a formulation that was very popular and still is, that this movement was not only rapid at 60,000 years ago, but it must have been coastal because it was so rapid. And so you see here in the middle here, in this figure, that there's a depiction that our origins are in Africa, perhaps even South Africa, and then populations move rapidly along the coastlines of Africa, rapidly on the coastline of Arabia, down into South Asia, and then finally into Australia by 50 to 60,000 years ago, perhaps. And I had a problem with this particular model in that I was working a lot in India, and we were finding a lot of interesting archaeological evidence, which I'll leave to other lectures. But when I started to work in Arabia, we were thinking that, is this coastal model correct or not? Can we in fact find archaeological sites in the interior? And many people had thought, well, if we migrated out of Africa, we must have sidestepped Arabia because it was just this barren, arid desert. And so no way populations would have been occupying such an inhospitable place. And so we wanted to test if this rapid coastal model at 60,000 years ago was in fact correct. And I've been working in what's called the Southern Dispersal Zone, looking at Arabia and South Asia, and trying to tell a slightly different story from an interdisciplinary perspective. And that's part of the story that I'll give you a really quick overview about now. And when you're looking at the archaeological record of Arabia, first of all, it's quite abundant. It's extraordinary. There's several hundred of these, what we call middle Paleolithic sites that occur anywhere between 200 to around 55,000 years ago. And you can see the white dots all across Arabia of these middle Paleolithic sites. These middle Paleolithic stone tools are quite different from the earlier ones that I showed you, perhaps being made by Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis. They're much smaller, they're much more planned, they're flake industries, very different from those large bifacial implements that were made by early humans earlier. At any rate, so we find these middle Paleolithic sites over a wide time period. And as you can see here immediately, there are many sites in the interior of Arabia, not just on the coastlines. And so it means to me already, right from the get-go, that movements out of Africa were not just coastal. They may have been coastal, but they're not exclusively coastal. We have no coastal evidence, in fact, of these early human migrations. There is none. There's none across the Indian Ocean rim. But what we do have is an abundance of archaeology in the interior. And back to the importance of integrating our mapping, here you see a wonderful map put together by some of our specialists in London. And you can see that you can easily walk from Africa and then into Asia, essentially the Middle East, right? Into the Levantine area as well as Arabia. You can walk up the Nile, you can cross the Sinai, and then you can go north or you can go south. And this is a model of looking at what we call the Tabuk Corridor, because you can see there was a whole network of rivers that extended from the Sinai into the Nafud Desert, into places like Tabuk and down into Tama and Juba. And then you can, of course, go north and then move in slightly different ways. But you can see a whole network of rivers. And look at all these lakes, all these dark blue dots are lakes that would have been present in the past. And the white dots are archaeological sites, Middle Paleolithic archaeological sites. So like earlier humans, later humans were simply walking across these terrestrial landscapes. These hunter-gatherers would have been following grasslands and savannas, and they would have been walking along rivers and lake shores where there would have been an abundance of food that hunters and gatherers would have been subsisting on. And so this is a map showing how we're putting together the paleohydrology as well as the archaeology. And as I indicated, there was this argument, a very common argument, that we only had one successful migration out of Africa 60,000 years ago. But as we looked at this Middle Paleolithic evidence, we thought that some of it could, in fact, be relating to the industries that Homo sapiens was making in Africa, the same kind of Middle Paleolithic industries. And as you can see here, when we date some of these archaeological sites ourselves, plus colleagues working across Arabia, you can see immediately that these Middle Paleolithic sites do not only date to 60,000 years ago. In fact, they date back to 125,000 years ago, 85,000 years ago, 75,000 years ago, and so on and so forth. And so these areas on this very complicated graph are just showing you here in red, these red bars, some of the dated archaeological, Middle Paleolithic archaeological sites of Arabia. And these green horizontal bars represent wet periods. And so we think that modern humans are simply walking terrestrially out of Africa many times in the past during Green Arabia episodes. And so this model is quite different, of course, from the rapid single coastal model at 60,000 years ago, really promoted by geneticists. As we're seeing here, the archaeological evidence of Arabia is making a very strong impact on what we think we know about the dispersal of our own species. Not only do we find the plentiful stone tool evidence and Middle Paleolithic sites of what we think are modern humans coming across Arabia, but lo and behold, we even find, most remarkably, their footprints. And here is a unpublished site study, which we're hoping soon to publish. That's in review right now. But we actually have the footprints, what we think are modern humans. You can see the footprints in this clay or mud on one of these lakes. And you can see the contours of the footprints, where the toes and the front of the foot would have been, and the back of the heel. And of course, there's your arch. And we've got a number of these footprints. But not only do we have the footprints of modern humans, but we have the footprints of many other animals. We can see, of course, that they were probably subsisting off animals like these, and we have the trackways of elephants and camels, even at this period of time. So this again gives you a snapshot of what life was like around 120,000 years ago in the heart of the Nefud Desert. And we have made an argument that these Middle Paleolithic sites relate to what we know in places like Africa. And we've made this argument that these Middle Paleolithic industries can be quite distinctive and perhaps are a sign of our species. But we were really excited to find this finger bone. And analyses showed that this fossil finger, was probably a representative of our own species, Homo sapiens. And we dated this finger bone directly, and that date came up around 85,000 years ago. And what made us so happy was that this finger bone of Homo sapiens was found in association with these Middle Paleolithic artifacts. And so here we had the very first association in Arabia between a human fossil and these Middle Paleolithic industries at an early date, prior to 60,000 years ago. And so this was a sign to us that modern humans were migrating across Arabia, and they were using these Middle Paleolithic toolkits. And this is the very first fossil of any human in Arabia. And so we were very happy and proud of this discovery. In fact, when we published this in one of the Nature journals, I was told that there were more than 2,000 posts in the media on this finger, and how, so it just goes to show you how important discoveries like this are. And so this was really good evidence for us, the kind of evidence that we were looking for and are still looking for in Saudi Arabia. And let me now turn to the third part of this lecture, which is about climate change and human responses to it. And of course, we have a lot of climate scientists and earth scientists involved in this work. And this is some climatic modeling. I talked about some of the mapping from satellite imagery, but we're also using climate science to look at what was the climate like in the past. And there were many episodes of the greening of Arabia in the past. And this is one model showing you that rainfall was plentiful across the Sahara and Arabia about 125,000 years ago. So here's an instance of a green Arabia in which in which animals and humans would have been crossing from Africa into and out of Arabia and then into other parts of Asia. And this is back to the Tis Al Ghada site, that very early site that we have, and some of the remarkable fossils. And this just depicts that Arabia is a land bridge to continents, essentially. So it is the critical part of the evolutionary story, both with respect to mammals and animals, but also human history. But here you can see that during these green episodes, when the lakes were forming, animals were actually getting into the heart of Arabia. And we have huge animals like these extinct elephants, what we call Paleoloxodon. And these elephants, of course, had to have a lot of fresh water and grasses, for example, eating, and shrubs. And so it tells us something about those environments, right? And what's even more remarkable, perhaps, than those elephants are finds of hippos. We actually have hippos on a number of archaeological sites in Saudi Arabia. And this is telling you that, of course, we had deep freshwater resources in the past. And we have ducks and other small animals in these sites, which we can, of course, tell you that these were freshwater resources. Now, these Green Arabia episodes are most interesting because they're the time of expansion of groups. But the million-dollar question is, what happened after these green intervals? So, of course, we know today that Arabia is a desert landscape for the most part. It's an arid situation, but that aridity and humidity was a constant fluctuation in the past. And so on sites like this lake that we have in the Rub al Khali, the Yempi Quarter, I had to imagine that humans might have been living around this lake, but what happened to them when it dried up? And so we think that this is a very important phenomenon to investigate, because we need to understand not only the Green Arabia episodes, but what happened to these populations when it really got bad, when it really went arid. And we actually think these populations either contracted into small zones, or perhaps they even went extinct many times in the past, only to rebound again in new Green Arabia episodes. And a lot of our work is centered on the last million years, but we've been also talking and working a lot in the last 10,000 years. And I think in particular, this is very important to thinking about contemporary society in Saudi Arabia and Arabia and in general, but also in arid zones around the world. And we're uncovering a fascinating past in Arabia ourselves and our colleagues. And I believe that this record of the last 10,000 years can tell us a lot about the contemporary world, our current lifestyles in a place like Arabia, but also what are we facing in the future? And so we've dedicated some attention to this. We just had a very high profile article on this topic. And our colleagues working in Southeastern Arabia along the Gulf Coast in places like UAE and Oman have noticed that there's big fluctuations in the last 10,000 years in terms of occupation history of Arabia. And they've noticed that there's big differences between interior desert occupation and coastal occupation. And there's this thought, these brown bars, these brown vertical bars, there's a thought that these episodes of these droughts had a very big impact on the occupation history of Arabia. It would have transformed societies, and it would have forced people to move to new ecological situations. And one of these is called the dark millennium. It was a period of aridity that occurred anywhere between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago. And it's a 600-year drought period. And as hopefully you can sort of make out here, you can see that people here in this brown vertical bar, this 600-year drought, people in the interior disappeared. They abandoned the interior. It suggests that the interior no longer had rivers or lakes that hunter-gatherers could live in. But those populations moved to the coast. And so here we get the development of pastoralism, the initiation of it, but also coastal resources coming into play. And so here, a 600-year drought is thought to have sort of wiped out populations, if you will, in the interior, and people were forced to move to the coastline and carry out their lives there. And so this would have had tremendous societal ramifications. Well, we've been working a lot in Saudi Arabia as opposed to Southeastern Arabia, and we wanted to test this hypothesis, this model that our colleagues have come up with. And here you can see Northern Arabian sites that we've been working in this region together with, of course, many others in Saudi Arabia. We've pulled some of this evidence together. And one of the things we looked at was historic rainfall patterns. So from about 1984 to 2015, and the yellow and green dots on this map represent the pooling of water. So as all the people of Arabia know today, when you do get heavy rainfall, you get some rivers and you get some pooling of fresh water, even today in the deserts. But in the past, it would have been even more rain. And we think that rainfall was about 300% greater in the past than it is today during those green intervals. And so you can imagine in Northern Arabia, because of the African monsoon and the westerlies coming from the Mediterranean, you would have had a very green and wet landscape. And when we go to some of the sites and date them in a place like Juba, where we're working in the Nafud Desert, we have found that some sites actually are present during this so-called dark millennium, that 600-year episode in which people were supposed to have disappeared in the interior. And what we see is that there is variability across Arabia in how people reacted to these droughts. And in some places, oases were forming, like at Juba, like at Tama, and many other places in Arabia. And there's a coalescence of groups coming around these ancient lakes. And we can see populations, even though there was a massive drought in parts of Arabia, people could successfully live in a place like Juba. And we have very good evidence for that here. And just to give you a sense of some of those transformations over the last 10,000 years, people were very ingenious. They weren't just reacting to these dry periods and these droughts. They actually learned how to engineer their landscapes. So this was different from the hunter-gatherers of the past, who lived on the basis of surface water for the most part. Now people were very ingenious, and they started to create canals and dams to capture the surface water, but also they started to dig wells. And this again started to transform society, especially as people brought domesticates into their lifestyle. So people were concentrating along oases, and then of course, as you all know, developing very important exchange networks with the introduction of the camel, for instance. So society was reacting to these drought and these green episodes, even over the last 10,000 years. and societies were adapting to these very harsh conditions. But I won't say that everything was so good, because we have evidence in the past of a lot of societal stress as well. So there were, in fact, very big impacts, probably, from these droughts. And we have some hints of evidence, even in human skeletons from a site like this cemetery in Oman, which indicate that the people had very poor health, all sorts of diseases and malnutrition, in fact. But we can also see in the rock art of a place like Juba, we have these very distinctive cattle in the rock art. And we can see some of them are very very large and look healthy, but some of them actually look like they're starving. We've interpreted this as the starvation of some of the fauna that we see in the rock art. And of course, this would have really stressed humans that were living at a place like the Juba Oasis in the past. So we have both interesting societal transformation, proactive change in terms of trying to mitigate droughts, but we also have impacts on those very populations as well. And this is a story that's basically untold, I believe. Even though there's been some publications on this, there's a lot more for us to learn. And I'm really happy, just about a year or two ago, Saudi Aramco came to the table, thanks to His Royal Highness, Prince Sultan. And Saudi Aramco helped us drill the Juba Paleolithic. And we have 80-meter section that we're studying. We have a large team of scientists studying this core. It's all unpublished, but this is going to tell us about environmental change of Arabia over the last 800,000 years. We've dated the lower part to 800,000 years ago now, all the way to the present. And so we're going to have a very rich environmental story to put the archaeological record into context. And one of the other things that we're trying to do looking forward and into the future is we've started to investigate the caves of Arabia. And we're working in central Saudi Arabia, but we've also started to expand into the Western province, into the Khaybar area. And we've done archaeological excavations there. And these cave sites are really unexplored archaeologically. We have found fascinating archaeological sites in them, but perhaps even more importantly, we have found bone, which we're doing ancient DNA studies on, so genetic work, but we're also drilling what's called the speleothems, the stalactites, and we'll be able to tell a very high resolution environmental story as well. And I just want to leave this last few slides. I just want to leave you with this story, that this all isn't about the past. This is all about the contemporary world that we all live in, but it's also about the future. We know that climate scientists are predicting places like the Middle East are going to increase in temperature anywhere between 2 to 5 degrees Celsius in the next 50 years. And while there are predictions of even more rainfall, we know that's associated with increased flash flooding. So the information that I've provided you today in a very brief overview, I think is relevant to the world that we live in today and the future world and predictions about the future and how to mitigate some of these environmental changes. And I'm speaking to KAUST, and I'm extremely happy to be doing that because I went to your website and I saw this amazing amount of scientific work going on at KAUST right now in terms of your science, working on air and water and food security. And this is fantastic. I have not actually been to KAUST. I've been dying to go there, but I'm very pleased to see there's all sorts of creative solutions to environmental change being studied at KAUST. And this is something that we as archaeologists would love to be collaborating with KAUST scientists on. But also, there are ways, as you see also depicted here in the UAE, to capitalize on the past in knowing the present. So you can see here that there's a globally recognized heritage site in the UAE, which is the foundation of which goes back for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And there's a recognition that the date palm, for example, and the irrigation was mastered by these people in Arabia in the past. Then we should learn about that in order to create new environments and new ecosystems in places like Arabia and Saudi Arabia. And all of this work has been wonderful from a scientific perspective. Like I said, we have about 85 scientific articles on our work in Arabia over the last 10 years. But so important to us has been getting the word out to the public. The public, of course, in Arabia, in Saudi Arabia, but also internationally. And we think this work has many lessons in it. So we think this is very important for education. And so working side by side with our Saudi colleagues, we have been putting out press releases, putting out information like on websites about what we're learning from our archaeological work. And we think it has a lot to say about not only the past, but also about today and what is going on Earth. And finally, my last slide, I just want to say that the work in Arabia has absolutely been stimulating. The discoveries have been amazing. The science output has been really tremendous. Our teams have been learning a lot. We hope to be working in Arabia, Saudi Arabia for the next, we've worked there for 10 years, but we want to work 10 more. We have a lot of work yet to do. But we think our work really can address many, many questions, not only about the past, like I said, but also about the future. And there have been big changes in ecosystems. There will be in the future. We need to think about sustainable farming. We need to be thinking about how do we efficiently use water resources. We need to think about extinction of animals and what effect does that have on society. And so I leave you there, and I just want to thank everyone for listening. I see there are several hundred people online, which is fantastic, reaching out across the world. But I really want to thank the Saudis, the Saudi government organizations for being our backbone, for working side by side with us. And I just have some people listed here. I can't possibly list everyone. There are literally hundreds of people to thank, but I thank you, and I thank you for listening, and I'm really happy to take any questions. You can also contact me. I'm on an email, I'm on Twitter, so please do get in touch, and I'd love to talk more about our work in any forum that anyone may suggest in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike, for this fascinating presentation. Thank you very much. You showed us that really a multidisciplinary approach is the key to answer, to bring answers to critical questions, such as human dispersal and climatic changes. So we will start the Q&A session. So I've seen some questions on the chat. So if I start with the one by Mike Carampelias, who's saying, so much water in Kayseri, so many lakes and rivers. I'm wondering what was the reason to lose them all? What remained from them? Any signs of living organism, at least plants?
This is new to me. I'm actually trying to find the question. I don't see it at top.
It's on the chat. Unfortunately, it's easier if it is on the Q&A session. So the question is, how did all the lakes and rivers disappear, and what is left is there any sign of living organism, like plants?
Yes, okay, so yes, so the lakes, like I said, we've counted about 10,000 lakes of Arabia. And we, in fact, were criticized for calling them lakes in one scientific publication. So we had to prove that they were lakes. And it's probably better to call them lakes and wetlands. But lakes are very deep bodies of water, more than several meters in depth. And we had to prove, of course, that they were, in fact, deep freshwater bodies. And of course, immediately when you see a creature like hippos, you're drawn to the idea, of course, they're at least wetlands, but hippos have to be fully immersed in water because actually the sun is not very good for them. And so we know the water depth must have been at least as deep as a hippo in some of the places that we're finding them. But we have done very precise scientific studies. We've actually looked at small creatures that were living in the lakes. And so we have shell of some of these creatures. Freshwater shells we have in them, and we can tell the species of shell that we have. And we know they are freshwater animals. So we know that for sure. We also have, I won't get into all the detail of what we call them and all that, but there are scientific studies which actually show how salty or how fresh the water actually was. And so we do laboratory work in order to prove that is the case. And we absolutely are certain that some of these lakes were in fact lakes. They were deep water bodies, and they had freshwater resources living within them. And that has to be the case because, as you see, like elephants and humans were attracted to these freshwater resources many times in the past. Now, why did they go dry? They went dry because the earth has been changing, of course. There's been cycles, natural cycles of wetting and drying through time. This is the period of glaciation and interglacial period. So Arabia has been alternately wetting and drying through time. These are natural cycles that Arabia has been experiencing. And that's so interesting because the lakes form and then they dry up over time. And we believe that this is almost acting like an engine for evolution and for history, because the lakes are coming and going, and people are expanding or contracting as those lakes come and go.
Thank you. We have a question from Ahmad Bahitam. He was asking, I can see there are some recent lakes in the empty quarter started to show up near Oman borders. Are these seasonal? Oops.
So I'm sorry.
So someone asked if the lakes that appears in the empty quarter near the border with Oman are seasonal.
The lakes in the empty quarter are, what was the last?
In the empty quarter, there are some lakes.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
They are seasonal or?
We think that, of course, some of the lakes would have been seasonal, but we also think these are permanent lakes. So the key point is that these lakes, when I say they were coming, they weren't just coming seasonally. Some of them were permanent. They would have been there for hundreds of years. So they would have been magnets for animals and people in the past. But the duration, how long they were around, probably varied a lot. So as I said, we probably have lake formation over the last 800,000 years. And so those lakes were coming. Some of them may have been more permanent. Some of them may have been more seasonal. And so, but we think for sure if not hundreds of years, some of those lakes could have been around for several thousand years even.
We have a question from Gopesh Jha, who says, firstly, it's a remarkable work, what you're doing in Saudi Arabia. Secondly, I have a question about modern human dispersal in Arabian context. When we talk about multiple waves of population coming and moving through or across Arabian Peninsula, do you see any technological or other behavioral variability in the archaeological records of the late Pleistocene sites that might tell us about the dispersal of multiple population?
There is variability for sure. So you know, of course, these middle Paleolithic sites occur across a period of time that exceeds 100,000 years. So, and of course, they occur from Oman and Yemen all the way up through northern Saudi Arabia. So geographically, it's also widespread. So if you're thinking that, you know, these middle Paleolithic technologies are geographically widespread and occur over a long period of time, of course, there's variability in these toolkits. And that's something that we need to learn a lot more about. And right now, we're trying to compare. We have a team of people examining these stone tools, comparing them, of course, within Arabia and through time, but also we're comparing them to the Levant, and we're comparing them to Africa. And so we're trying to see how similar and different these toolkits are through time and through space. And we're trying to see if potentially they associate with particular species like Homo sapiens, or perhaps even Neanderthals, which we know were present to the north.
I see. We had a similar question by Tisha Nagarkar, who asked as well, who asked about this change in tool technology, but she asking as well if the shift in climate was gradual or sudden. What's the time range? What do we know about that?
The time range of?
What, like how sudden or how gradual it was?
How the climate was involved?
The climate change.
And
how the
climate change relates to food resources.
Yes. How long it took to have major change in the environment and.
Yeah, I mean, this is a topic, you know, the idea of domestication, you know, how we incorporated plants and animals into our lifeways, particularly in Arabia, we are still learning so much about. There has to be a lot more study of this topic and how domestication changed through time. But we also, I mean, so there needs to be a lot more study of the fauna that we do uncover, but also the flora, the actual botany.
Yes.
And we have very little in the way of botany. And that is something that a lot more energy needs to be put on, because this is very important, not only to changes in the use of domesticates through time in Arabia, but also we know that geneticists and people, I think even working in KAUST are interested in what are salt-tolerant species.
Absolutely.
So we need to understand what are the best crops, for example, to be planting, and what has evolved in Arabia locally, and we can see what strategies were successful or not in the past.
Then I have a question, pretty technical, from Sergei Osipov. It's, dear Professor Petraglia, thank you for giving a broadening view of Arabia. I have a question about the archaeological evidence of the UV stress in the region. Recently, I've discovered that volcanic eruptions can cause the stratospheric ozone depletion, and demonstrated that Toba, 70,000 years ago, produced ozone hole in tropics and likely contributed to the human genetic bottleneck. Do you see any historical evidence of exposure to UV radiation after major eruptions? Is it something that
You're talking about volcanic eruptions and their effects?
Absolutely.
Okay, so we know in Arabia. Okay, so there, I believe the first question might have been about like the Toba super eruption. And this was a volcanic event about 74,000 years ago. Is that part of the question?
That's the question. That was more the context. And then the question is more, is there any historical evidence of UV radiation after eruption in Saudi Arabia?
Okay, so I have I'll answer that sort of in two parts. One is this massive volcanic eruption. It's called a super eruption that happened 74,000 years ago in Indonesia.
Yes.
And that volcano is thought to have almost wiped out humanity. And it is actually thought to have wiped out many species, not only humans, but animal species in Asia. But this was a very popular theory, and a lot of groundwork was not actually done. And our work in both South Asia and Arabia shows no necessary correlation between these extinction events, even if they existed, and the Toba super eruption. So we do not think the Toba super eruption, which was this gigantic eruption that did happen 74,000 years ago, has a direct impact on human populations living in places like Arabia. What does have an impact is climate change. So around 74,000 years ago, and then into 70,000 years ago, it was getting more and more arid in a landscape like Arabia. And we believe that it's climate change that had more of a profound impact than the volcanic eruption itself. But I should just say that, you know, our team started to work in the Khaybar zone of Western Saudi Arabia, and that volcanic landscape is absolutely fascinating. And those harats are amazing. And we know some of those harats have gone off, of course, in the deep past, but also some of them have gone off in the last 10,000 years. And we very much want to study that process because we think the occupation history of Western Arabia, as well as Arabia itself, may have been influenced by some of these volcanic events. But we know very, very little about how these volcanic events would have affected societies. But that is something we can learn. And in fact, what I was saying was looking at those speleothems, those stalactites in the caves, which we're drilling, can give us very precise environmental information, which we can correlate with the volcanic eruptions. So we'd like to be able to do that in order to see if societies in the last 10,000 years, for example, were impacted by these active volcanoes.
Yes, the Khaybar region has lots of caves and lava tubes.
Absolutely, and we're working in them now, and the archaeological information is precious and amazing, and it needs some protection, but the real scientific work is just beginning in them.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to raise. I know, by example, the Umjirsan cave is visited. Did you find any human bones in the Umjirsan cave, or only animal? I thought there was a hyena and.
There's very good occupation information in the caves. We've hardly touched it. We've only spent one season in the caves, but we know that amateurs have been in the caves and been reporting this information for a long time.
Yes.
But also I should say professionally, the Saudi Geological Survey has been doing a fantastic job in mapping and working in the caves. They're our partners. And our first season in the caves was done in partnership with the Saudi Geological Survey. And we have not published that information yet, but that's something we're working on. In fact, we were about to go back to do work in the caves, but unfortunately, coronavirus hit us.
Oh, there is another one by Ahmed Nasser, who's asking, who's saying, thanks a lot for this fascinating lecture and information. We learned a lot. I'm asking if there are any indications of the development or transition from Acheulean to Middle Paleolithic in Arabia. What will be the date and the main characteristic?
So just for the non-technical folks out there, the Acheulean is a name that is given to these early, what I called hand axe industries, these stone tools that we find in places like Dawadmi. And we have some Acheulean sites that we've dated in Arabia, like I said, 200,000 years ago or so. But these are very young ages for this time period, this what we call the Acheulean. As we know, the Acheulean can go back almost 2 million years of age, and in places like Africa. But we don't have the earliest Acheulean sites of Arabia yet. They have not been dated. We think we know some of the landscapes that these sites occur on, but we cannot date them yet. And again, more work needs to be done on early human occupation of Arabia. But most of the Acheulean sites, these early human sites that we've been working on, only date to very young periods in that time frame. But I should say that one other thing is that you asked about a transition, I believe, that so we don't have a very clear transition between the Acheulean and the Middle Paleolithic yet, but it seems like it's possible that that's either a local development in part, but it can also be another migration of other species of humans into Arabia as well. That's something we really need to tease apart.
Thank you. A question from Muriel Gros-Balthazar, who's asking, talking about date palms, is there any evidence of them growing in Arabia in the prehistoric time?
Date palms in Arabia?
Date palms in Arabia. What is the earliest evidence of them growing? Do we have any evidence of?
You know, this isn't my specialization, but certainly, you know, the date palm is something very important in terms of investigating, in terms of early oases of Arabia, and that's something I know is of great interest in places like Tama in order to examine the origin of some of these domesticates. So yes, that's a very important local development. There may be some imports from other regions originally, of course, but the development of the date palm is a big thing in Arabia, as we know today, but that has roots that go back many hundreds, if not thousands of years. And that's really important in order to understand, because as you saw, some of the evidence suggests that this kind of industry is in fact very important as developing genetic signatures of the early dates and what's the best sort of types of dates to be growing in a place like Arabia. So that was very important as a domesticate that came into early economies, definitely.
We have one from Abdullah Al-Zarani that I may ask you. If there are any further evidence for the presence of Homo sapiens around the coast of the Western Kingdom.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Zarani, for asking that question. You know, obviously, fossils, human fossils, are the gold mine of human evolution, if you will. It's something that we need to put dedicated effort onto. We were very lucky to find the human fossil at Augusta in the Nafud Desert, but we need to be doing a lot more field work. We know there are fossils of animals on many of these sites in the kingdom, but we need to be working much more rigorously to be finding fossils. We need a lot more teamwork. We need to be looking for places in particular where we think the human fossils may preserve. And that is why we also turn to the caves, Dr. Zerani. So we need to find places that have well-preserved bones. And many times in the past, people have just done surface surveys for many decades in places like Arabia. And on the surface, you will not find human fossils or early human fossils because they won't preserve well, because they've been exposed to the elements. So we need to find places where we have good preservation, and then we need to target them for more excavation, and we will find human fossils, inshallah.
So, really interesting. We have a question about from Martin May, who is working at KAUST, and is asking, he found some stone tools north of KAUST, and is asking, what do you know about, I'm looking for the exact question, which is here. So north of KAUST, near Rabik, in sort of in a sedimentary fan consisting mostly of large pebbles. Is asking, how can such stone tools be understood in the context of the presented migration model?
So the question is about stone tools.
These stone tools that have been found near KAUST, between KAUST and Rabik.
Okay, yeah. So I would just say to you that I showed you some maps of archaeological sites that we know of. And of course, this comes from databases from the Saudi ministries themselves, archaeological databases that we can all have and enjoy, but also from the literature. People have been writing articles for years. But by no means should we consider that what is known in Arabia or Saudi Arabia, because there are, for one site that we know about, there's probably many thousands more yet to be discovered. So it wouldn't be surprising to me at all that there are archaeological sites all around the KAUST region.
Yeah.
There's going to be many sites. And one sign of that, as I was saying, when we go and study the rivers and the lakes, on the several hundred lakes we've been on, 70% of them have archaeology on them. And yet we've only been to 200 of 10,000. So that means there's many thousands of sites yet to be discovered in Saudi. And if you have found a site that you think is very important and you want to preserve it, please get in touch with the ministries. Archaeologists work for the Heritage Commission, and that's their job, to work with you in order to preserve these places and these landscapes, because they're so precious and they're about our history and they're about Saudi history. So if you take things away from the sites, there's so much less we can learn about the history.
Okay, there is a dedicated, I think there is a dedicated address. I'll check on that, and I will add it on the Twitter, on the Twitter page, so people can record this if needed. Thank you so much. I cannot tell you, but on the chat, there are really positive comments with wow, and people saying that it was fascinating and posting happy faces. I won't risk to reproduce. So it was a really fascinating lecture. I will just thanks as well everybody for attending. I want, so next week it's Eid al-Fitr holiday. There won't be any lecture. And then I will see you again in 2 weeks on Wednesday, June 3, with a talk by Professor Michael McDonald Michael MacDonald is an honorary fellow at Wolfson College, Oxford, and a fellow of the British Academy. He has worked for the last 45 years on the languages, scripts, inscriptions, and history of ancient Arabia. During his webinar, Professor MacDonald will tell us more about the Arabs. Indeed, many references to Arabs are found in ancient literature, but always by foreign writers. Why is this? You will learn as well what is known about spoken Arabic and the development of written Arabic. So I hope you will be there in 2 weeks. And meanwhile, stay safe and continue practicing indoor culture.